Today, I'm going to show you how to turn this old propane tank into a wonderful piece of art, which is over 3 feet wide and almost 9 feet tall. So follow along. Let's go. I bought this propane tank from a buddy, and he also let me use this trailer. I'm not sure what this thing weighed, but it was quite heavy. He put it on with the tractor, but I'm gonna have to use old man strength to get it off. It wasn't that big of a deal, but these bigger pieces of metal are often a little unwieldy, as you can see from this video. So right here, I'm just trying to come up with a game plan. I wasn't really sure how I was going to make a straight line around this circular object, but I need to make a pretty accurate line to make sure all these rings that I'll end up cutting out of this propane tank are as accurate as possible. And I was just trying to figure that out at this spot. You can see here I'm putting this little piece of metal, and I'm going to line the clamps up and line this piece of metal up so I can draw a line with the chalk and make for a really straight cut. In order to hold down the blocks of wood and the metal, I'm using these cheap old Harbor Freight clamps. They're a woodworking clamp, but they work great. So here I'm just double checking the measurements. This metal is really thick, and I'm trying not to mess up because making cuts in this is very difficult with the limited tools that I'm using on this project. So like they always say, measure twice and cut once, and that's what I'm going to do here. Here I'm just setting the depth on the circular saw with the metal cutting blade. I'm trying to get the best cut and use the best part of the blade in order to make this blade last as long as possible. I think it was like $34, so I'm just making sure that I can get as many cuts out as I can and make the blade last as long as possible. I have to do roughly, I'm cutting 6 circles out, so I believe it was 7 or 8 cuts I had to make to get 6 circles out, because I had to cut the end of this propane tank off because that was waste. A fellow metal worker told me that these blades cut like butter through metal, and that wasn't my experience with this thing, unfortunately. I don't know if I was twisting the blade or what, but it just wasn't cutting. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out what's going on and check it out, and knowing that this blade is dulling while I'm making this cut. I don't have much luck with these metal cutting blades, at least on round surfaces. So I try to give it another shot, trying to get this blade to cut through this, because I have a ton of cuts. I'm getting a little nervous here, realizing that making these cuts in this 3/8 metal is going to be much harder than I was anticipating. I thought I would cut through this like butter, but that obviously wasn't the case. So I tried one of these Harbor Freight blades, the Hercules ones, after killing the Diablo one from Home Depot, and in my opinion these actually cut better. The only problem is they didn't last very long. This sliced through it really easily, and I was impressed. I mean, for them, I think these are probably pretty close to Diablo, to be honest. I can't remember exactly what they cost, but they worked fairly well. I'm still hoping and praying that these will start cutting a little bit better, because as you can see, I haven't even made the first cut here or finished the first cut. And like I said earlier, is I have to cut 6 rings out of this, and this ended up taking me a massive amount of time. Was not expecting it to take this long, so I figure I better process later on, and I'll show a little bit of that as we get further into the video. But I will cut out most of this cutting, but it took almost shoot, I don't know, probably 10 hours to cut 6 rings, maybe more. So I decided to try the trusty 4.5-inch right angle grinder, and this ended up working really well. The only problem was that it was eating blades cutting this thick of a material, but I ended up burning through just a ton of 4.5-inch cutoff wheels just trying to get this job done. And after watching Fire Tool, what the heck is that name of that other YouTuber? I don't know. Anyways, I didn't want to like plunge cut with the right angle grinder, so I was just tracing back and forth, just taking off a little bit of material with each pass. As you can imagine, that took a long time. Here I switched to the GoPro camera on a chest mount just to see what it would look like to film me building a sculpture. I had never really done it this way before. I thought it'd be a neat experiment, so you can kind of see my work area. I'm working outside of one of the garage doors I have here, and I'm gonna do a little bit more cutting with this grinder from, a pretty neat perspective, I think. You can really see in this shot that there's a white chalk line there that I made with that piece of metal that you can see on the right hand side of the ground, and I'm really trying to follow this chalk line as accurate as possible, and cause these are the rings right now that I'm cutting out that are going to be the main body of the sculpture, so I want them to be as accurate as I possibly can get them. In order to cut the full circle all the way around, I need to rotate this tank, which took quite a bit of time to continually do, but I had to move it 2 or 3 times each cut to make the full circle. After I was done moving it, then I had to re-mark everything in order to get a straight cut and re-measure everything. You can see here I'm struggling with it a little bit, and then I stick a piece of wood underneath it to brace it so it doesn't wobble when I go to make my next cut. I end up cutting most of this cutting out of the video because it gets boring, but I wanted to show you what happened to my circular saw after I changed to an abrasive disc. Don't know if you can see it, but I got some of the magic smoke coming out of that one. I was trying to see if the abrasive blade would be a little bit quicker, but it doesn't seem to be doing the job. So I finally have at least half the sculpture cut out. Now I wanted to lay it out and kind of see what it's going to start looking like. So I lay out these 3 large metal rings and get ready to take some measurements to make sure that the sculpture is going to be around the height that I want it to be, which is roughly around 9 feet tall. So after I finish laying these first 3 rings out, I know that I need to get back to cutting, unfortunately. More cutting. While I'm building the sculpture back at the shop, I'm having concrete poured for the sculpture location. This is a site-specific sculpture, and it needed a 4x4 concrete pad to hold it down. Here is the finished set of 6 rings. I believe this took me roughly 12 hours to cut these out. I'll have to find a better way to do this for future projects. So finally we get done with most of the cutting and it's time to start forming this sculpture and doing some real fabrication. Unfortunately, I thought it would be pretty easy to bend this 3/8 round steel, but it ended up being a lot harder than I anticipated. There was a ton of spring on it, so I was trying every which way to make this inner circle that I had to make it a smaller diameter. I was using 2x4s, pry bars. I was trying to bend it by hand. And it took a whole combination of things to get it straight in the center of the outer diameter circle and to make it the size I wanted. The inner circle was going to be 3 inches smaller around the circumference in order to make this sculpture. You can see here I'm using a pry bar and some 2x4s to get this inner diameter steel ring back down to the diameter that I need to, but there's so much spring in it, I'm just really having difficulty doing that safely, really. This next method of just sitting on it and using my weight to get it down to the right circumference ended up being a little bit easier. I'd sit on it and then clamp it to get it close to where I needed it, and then I'd stick it in the inside of the other circle. I just need to check the final measurements of the inner diameter circle before I trim it down to its next size and weld it. I need to internally brace these circles, so I'm using some 14 gauge steel and I'm cutting that with a different skill saw since I burned my other one up, and I'm using the Hercules Harbor Freight cutoff blade, and you can see it cuts through this stuff really well. I was able to cut everything with this blade really easily, and I use this 2x4 and those Harbor Freight clamps as a straight edge so that the cut would be as accurate as possible. Worked out awesome. I need to slice up a bunch of spacers for the ribbing of this circle, but it's pretty easy with this right angle grinder. And then I'll place it and make sure the circle is centered inside the outer diameter circle. I repeated the marking, cutting, and clamping step about a billion times until I had enough of the internal bracing pieces of metal to center the circle correctly and make sure I thought it was strong enough to hold up the next 2 circles above it. I wanted to make sure that there was be no deformation when they were all welded together and the sculpture was standing on its own out in the public space. So we're finally at the point that we can start tack welding this bracing in to make this sculpture, start taking a lot more shape. I won't fully weld these in just in case I need to move them around or manipulate the metal a little bit more. I'm at this point still really unsure of exactly what type of bracing I'm going to need to make this circle strong enough to hold everything up to support the weight. After the earlier fiasco with the 4.5-inch grinder, I decided to upgrade to this 7-inch one to see if I could cut through this 3/8 metal quicker. And as you can tell, probably it goes way faster with this 7-inch. So what I'm doing here is I'm just trimming this inner diameter ring to fit precisely, which then I will weld the seam and make it look a lot more smooth. This bigger 7-inch disc, which this is a benchmark abrasive disc, really cuts through this thicker metal way faster. So if you often work in thicker metal like I do, I would definitely upgrade to this bigger right angle grinder. You can see when I finish this cut that the metal sprung back pretty forcefully, so now I need to pry it back out in order to do the weld correctly. So I will end up sticking another brace in here and then weld it together. I decided I wanted to fully weld in some of the internal braces before I pried the circle back together. I thought that if I tried to pry it with it just tack welded in place, it might distort the inner circle, and I was trying to avoid that if at all possible. So I go ahead and I fully weld these in before I weld that seam together. Here I'm welding that seam I've been talking about for about 5 minutes. I want it to be really, really good weld. It's going to be visible. This will get ground down, but I still want it to be a good weld with no hole in it. So I put a lot of heat into this part of the sculpture as I was welding it. And I was feeling pretty good here and having a good day, and I had the music blasting, so I got to continue the voiceover so that it will cut the music out. So keep listening. Rechecking my work just to make sure after all this manipulation and welding that the metal piece is still where I want it to be. I'm not too far along in the process where I couldn't, knock some stuff out and move it around if I had to. But if I ended up fully welding all these braces, it would be much more difficult to get this inner circle in the spot where I want it. And now I'm just reclamping everything and putting more bracing in to strengthen up and stiffen up this very bottom circle on this sculpture. So there'll be a lot more welding here. I think you get the point. Lots of welding, more welding, and more welding. So we don't need to continually watch me tack and weld stuff. We'll move along here in the build process. So the first circle's done. It went pretty well. Took me a couple hours to do. Now we will start on the second one, but I will fast forward most of it. We ended up doing this a third time. It's a lot of the same. It's the same welding. The process got a little bit faster as we went through it, but I don't think that you guys want to see the whole thing repeat. It was quite a bit of work. It took a couple hours per circle to do, but in the end, came out awesome. All right, I got all 3 circles made and fabricated, and they're pretty sturdy, so I have to skin the outside. This sculpture is going to be 3 solid rings, and in order to do that, I got to use some sheet metal and skin the outside. Now, the inside and outside ring are 3/8, but the skin itself will be roughly 16 gauge. I was really trying not to waste a lot of material on this, so I thought that if I had did a whole circle, traced a whole circle on here, it would waste a lot of that material. So I ended up doing half a circle so I could cut out half a moons one at a time. I thought that would probably be the most efficient way to do this. In order to cut this, I need to trace the inside and the outside, and then I'll use some electric shears to cut this out as quick as possible. These shears are the Harbor Freight brand. I don't use them a whole bunch, so I wanted to get a cheap set, but I gotta say it worked really, really good for cutting out these semicircles. I definitely recommend it and would use them again. I initially had tried to cut this out with a right angle grinder, but it wasn't giving me the edge I wanted. It was just a little bit too slow. So these worked perfect, and I highly recommend them if you need to cut out some shapes out of sheet metal. They're pretty easy to manipulate around the curves. Just finishing up the first one, and I only have, what is it, 12 more to go. I gotta do both sides on each of them. Now it's time for a test fit and see how close this is to the circle. As you can see, I think it worked perfectly. It's gonna be awesome. Unfortunately, even though I tried super hard to make this circle perfectly round, it is not. So these sheet metal cutouts or side skins need to be rotated and oriented correctly. Otherwise, there's a lot more finish work to do, which I'm trying to avoid. So back to the fun part where I get to stick pieces of metal together to create something pretty neat. So I will do the same on all three of these circles. I will tack two semicircles, or fully weld actually two semicircles on either side of these things to fully encase them and put the skin on them. I was using this large 7-inch grinder to prep this corner for weld. Makes it much easier when the metal's all level and there's a nice bevel there to get the weld in. On this grinder, instead of a hard abrasive disc, I'm using a flap wheel. It's a little bit takes off a little bit less material, and it's not so destructive. It makes a really nice clean area for welding. After I get done prepping the joint, I'll tack weld this all the way around before doing a final weld. Here you can see I've got the three rings that I've already fabricated laying on the ground, and I'm trying to line them up in a very straight way using a piece of C-channel as a straight edge and a ruler. I want the ruler to be exactly the same dimensions on the top and the bottom. Therefore, it's straight when it's mounted vertically. Here I'm checking how tall it's going to be. I want to make sure it's really close to 9 feet. I was hoping for over 9 feet, but I know it's going to come in right underneath 9 feet, which is really all right. And I'm putting some clamps here to hold it together because I will end up notching these circles right here to put in some more bracing in between all three circles just to make it a lot more sturdy. I figured just welding them together with no internal bracing wouldn't make them as strong as I was comfortable with. So a little extra bracing wasn't that big of a deal, and it ended up working out pretty well. You can see here the 1.5 inch square tubing that I'm going to notch for and put in place so I can weld it on both of the inside of both these circles. And I'm doing this, like I said earlier, just to make this circle sculpture a lot more rigid. And I'm just using regular old soapstone to make my marks on this metal. So I'm just using the speed square here to make sure I get a pretty accurate notch. 1.5 inch tubing, like I said, and I will use one of the grinding tools here to notch this accurately. Whenever I use the old finger remover here, I make sure to have my gloves and all my PPE on, like my face mask, my hearing protection. This thing will bite you if you're not paying attention. But it does work good, and it makes really quick work of this 1.5 inch notch. To save a little time, I didn't notch it right in the center of this circle. I notched it on the edge. I thought making only 3 cuts would make it a lot quicker operation. You can see here that the 1.5 inch tubing fits, but it's a little cockeyed in there for some reason. I didn't cut the notch exactly straight, so I had to do a little clean out, but there's a little more work. It ended up fitting really well in there. And now, as you can see, it fits in there perfect and no need for any more work. This will make it really easy to weld. So it's the same process for the other circle. I mark it and then I notch it. Nothing too exciting, but needs to get done. I must say though, I did a much better job notching this one. I only had to cut it once. I didn't have to go back after the fact and make sure that the tube fit in there like it should. It just worked out the first time perfectly. So after I got both of these circles, or all three of these circles, notched correctly, I needed to go back and start reskinning it and start actually wrapping up the sculpture. I'm starting to see the end, and I'm getting pretty excited about it. The reason I'm tacking all over the place is I'm really trying to spread out these tack welds, and I'm trying to minimize as much warping as possible in this piece of metal. I want it to be totally flat when I'm done fully welding it. Now that these circles are fully skinned, it's time to lay some full beads. I want to fully weld inside and out all the way around this circle. So that's 4 different welds that are roughly 36 inches each. So quite a bit of feet of welding in just one circle. And again, I'm spreading out these welds in order to keep the heat into the part minimum to prevent distortion. Even with me being as careful as I could, the metal still warped just slightly, so I'm using this little sledgehammer I have to hold down the metal and close the gap so I can get a better weld in there. This little sledgehammer with the cutoff handle, by the way, is an awesome tool. I definitely recommend somebody make this for their metalworking shop. You can kind of see what this notching looks like. These little pieces of 8 inches of tube that will notch into each of the circles to reinforce it. I'm fully welding them in right here. It was a little bit of a tight fit, but worked out all right in the end. You can see a little bit of a flame there from the welding. I actually didn't know there was a finish on the end of this, or on the outside of this tube, until that happened. So I finished welding those 2 pieces of square tubing that connect the sculpture to each other. Now I'm going to fully enclose the center ring of the sculpture. I start off by doing a bunch of little tack welds again to reduce the heat going into the metal as to not warp it. And then I'll come back, trim it, and then do a final weld. Here I'm just finishing up a little trimming in order to get a better area for welding. And then we'll final weld the entire top of this circle. With the magic of editing, it looks like I'm welding this pretty quickly, but this little section, you can see where all the 1-inch tack welds are. This section with the 1-inch tack welds actually took me over 7 minutes of welding. Each circle really had a ton of welding in it. Well, after about 3 days of welding and grinding on the circles, I've gotten to the point where now I am welding this rectangular tubing, or the square tubing, into the base, so that I can securely mount this to the pedestal that's going on. You can see here I'm not fully done with the welding yet, but I've gotten really close, so I'm getting excited. You can see the sculpture starting to take form. It's awesome. I'm welding this in really hot. I want to make sure that I get great penetration, especially on this bottom part. This 1.5 by 1.5 square tubing is all that's really holding 8 feet of sculpture into some 1/4-inch plate. So welding is of the utmost importance here. Alright, all the circles are completely welded now, and it's time to do the final grind. I'm going to grind all these welds smooth, which is 36 inches times 4 for each circle. So a ton of welding and a ton of grinding. I wanted a smooth finish on the circle. I wanted it to look like one piece. I don't really want you to see the welds. And I'm breaking out the big 7-inch angle grinder with a benchmark abrasive wheel on it. Makes quick work of this, or as quick as you can make this work. It was pretty brutal in the end, but I think that the end product came out amazing. All right, this point of the fabrication process was pretty intimidating. I was actually a little bit nervous. I'm really trying to make sure all these circles are in line with each other and square. And because I'm building it on my driveway right here, which is not flat or square or level or anything, I'm using this piece of C-channel because it is flat to lay all the circles on it, which I then will clamp everything together and get it as straight as I possibly can using the tools that I have. I'll have to do these bigger pieces like this until I get a large enough fabrication table, which is definitely in the cards soon. I'm doing a final clamp up here so that I can make sure that these things do not move while I'm welding in the 1.5-inch tubing into both sides of this. These two circles actually weren't level with each other, so I'm using this second clamp in order to make sure that the two circle sides are level with each other, because I think it looks a lot better like that. I'm doing a bunch of fiddling around here because I'm actually pretty nervous about doing the final welds on this thing. The last thing I want to do is tack everything and weld everything and to not be level. So I'm double, triple checking all my measurements, all the levels, clamps, everything to make sure that I have a good level surface to weld on, or level sculpture. All right, it's the moment of no return. I'm going to fully weld these circles all together and no turning back now. Well, I guess there is if I decide I wanted to cut everything up and start over. But I do not want to do that, so I made sure everything was perfect before I got to this point, and now it's time to just get it done. So I've got most of the welding done. The circles are almost fully welded to each other, so I stand it up here, and man, I'm getting excited with the way this thing looks. I really am super happy with how it has come out, and I can't wait to get this thing fully finished. Almost done. Had a little bit more welding to do here before we moved on to the next step of the process, but you can see that it's really coming along. Let me know what you think about it. Getting closer and closer every second, every little bit. I'm doing a little bit more grinding here so I can get the cover plate to sit in this little section of the sculpture correctly. You can see me fitting it in there and making sure that the gaps aren't too large. And then I will do some welding on this one, and this will be a quick little weld. There's about 4x4x4x4 weld in here, and I will cover this and sand this smooth so you won't be able to see it very well even up close. Alright, this sculpture is getting mounted with some 1/4-inch steel plate, which will then be bolted to concrete, but here I'm using my DeWalt skill saw with that Hercules blade you saw earlier in the video, and you can tell it makes pretty quick work of this metal. Worked pretty good. This metal is just thick enough where it makes you reevaluate what you're doing in the moment. This hole needs to be cut so the square tubing can be welded to and support the sculpture. I mark the center and then I make various small cuts to get the metal out of there. It's a little bit harder to cut steel out of the middle of a plate with just a right angle grinder, but if you make small little cuts of various angles, you'll get it out of there pretty easily. Even with the grinder, I need to get the cold chisel out and knock out these little pieces of metal because I wasn't able to punch through it with the grinder without damaging the base plate. But they come out easy enough. Now I need to drill 4 holes in order to mount this sculpture to the concrete. So I use a steel punch to make 4 little punch marks in each corner of the steel, and then I'll drill all 4 holes. I need to use an old car jack to line up this base because this piece of 1/4 inch 4x4 is still super heavy. And I'll put a little tack in here to hold it in place, and then I will square it up after I get a good tack going. This will just help hold it in place so it doesn't fall off and doesn't move around too much. I want to make sure that the base is absolutely square so the sculpture doesn't lean one way or the other. Once I have the base where I want, I will fully weld the square tubing in the bottom of it. I had to do a little more adjustment on the base before I fully welded it in, but I finally got it to exactly where I wanted to, and then fully welded it in and eventually grinded it smooth so it would sit flat on the platform that it's being mounted on. I'm putting this big nut in the bottom of the square tubing just for a little bit more reinforcement to keep the square tubing from being crushed for whatever reason. And I'll fully weld it in to make it, one solid piece of steel. It may not really have a positive effect, but my thinking at the time was a little bit more metal in this area would be much better for strength. All right, the time I've been super excited about and waiting for quite a while, it seems like, is about to stand this sculpture up and see what it looks like fully standing up, which I haven't got to yet. I've worked on this completely from the ground. As I was turning it around here, I realized that the sculpture was a little bit more flexible at the base than I really wanted it to be. I thought that nut would take up some of the flexibility, but it did not. So I'm going to end up having to weld the bottom of the sculpture to the top of the base there, which I was trying to avoid because I didn't like the way it looked. But unfortunately, I had no other options at this point. It'll be fine. So here I'm welding up the bottom of the sculpture to the base to make it a lot more sturdy, and it worked really well. I'm just laying a quick 1.5 to 2-inch bead on the bottom on both sides. And you can see I used a car jack and a 4x4 to put the sculpture where I wanted it to while I was welding. And as you can see by my unscientific flex test, that it's a way more sturdy, and I approve of this right here. Much better. And here it is fully realized. I am super happy with how it came out. This is by far the largest sculpture I have made today, and I couldn't be more proud of what the finished product came to be. All right, the day I've been waiting for. It's install day. Time to get this thing loaded up in the back of the truck and over to the install location, which is just a couple miles away. Overall, the sculpture isn't super heavy, but because of its large size, it's a little bit hard to handle. All right, we're here at the sculpture location where it will be finally installed. And luckily, I was able to back my truck right up to where the sculpture is going to go. So I was able to slide it out of the bed and drop it right down onto the cement pad where it will be mounted with some red bolts. All right, onto the final part of this sculpture is getting it installed with these screws. I'm using this rechargeable Hilti hammer drill, which worked awesome. I had never used one of these before. I will be purchasing one. I borrowed this one from a buddy, but worked great. All right, here it is, Anillo, installed in Belchertown, Massachusetts, right next to the Lake Wallace Century Trail. Please go by and check it out and let me know what you think. I really love it. I think it came out amazing. Please let me know what you think of it yourself. Catch you on the next one.